You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD candidate at Northwestern University, studying Russian literature and film.
And I'm Cameron Lalana, a literature enthusiast and guy working in media. We're two friends who met studying in Russia, and we like talking about books so much that we made it into a podcast.
And speaking of the podcast, this is the podcast for people who are trying to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture. Every episode, we're going to be bringing you the background and analysis you'll need to know to understand these works.
If you're interested in supporting us, you can head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. That's also where you can sign up for our email list, where we'll be sending you daily emails about the book that we are covering today, which, speaking of, what are we covering today, Matt?
If you want. We don't have to email you daily, but if you want, we could. It's not forced. It's not a forced daily email. Unless you want. In which case you could.
We're not the Soviet state. We're not here to tell you that you're going to get the email in your inbox.
Speaking of the Soviet state, this week we are delving into chapters 1 through 31 of Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. This is a part of an extensive, overcommitted, and quite frankly, ridiculous amount of work series for us that we're doing on Grossman's Life and Fate. If you're not aware, we're also doing daily episodes going chapter by chapter, where we're talking about some of the finer points of the writing and talking about the discussion that we're getting on Instagram and in our Discord. So if you're interested in that, more info down in the description. And pretty soon, if you're looking for these daily episodes, they're going to be archived on their very own dedicated RSS feed, meaning that you're not going to be able to find them on our main podcast feed. So when that happens, a link to that will be in the description as well.
Absolutely. So you can keep an eye out for that in our episodes, and as well as those daily episodes in the feed itself.
Yeah, we realize we're kind of inadvertently clogging our whole podcast feed with the daily episodes, but we still want to do them because we started. Well, hey, here we are.
Here we are, dealing with things with unintended consequences, much like many of the topics that we'll be covering in the book.
Yes, dealing with the unintended consequences of me saying, hey, Cameron, what if? And Cameron never saying no. We reap what we sow.
I usually think, almost always think that you've got good ideas, so it's really the same brain style. Yeah.
That is the problem.
That is the problem bouncing around here. Anyway, so we're talking about Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. You may have been here for our Stalingrad series, or one of two times that we've run our episode on his short story, the Sistine Madonna. But now we are moving forward into actually the real Battle of Stalingrad, unlike the book Stalingrad, which is kind of the run-up to the Battle of Stalingrad. Although, by this point, the battle is basically lost for the USSR. So let me set you a scene here. Let's talk about Vasily Grossman himself.
Please paint me a picture.
Some of you may be coming here from our Stalingrad series. Some of you may be coming only from our daily episodes. Some of you may be coming from both. Some of you may be coming from neither. So here's a quick rundown on Vasily Grossman. Very brief on his early life, but mostly talking about what leads us to this novel. So Vasily Grossman is born into the town of Berdichev, into a Jewish family in the very late Russian Empire. He's born in 1905, and he's born into what's known as the Pale of Settlement. And until the end of the Russian Empire, I think it stops being enforced in 1915, but it's still in the books. And obviously, once the Russian Empire falls, this falls away entirely. He lives in this area called the Pale of Settlement, which encompasses several modern-day nations, which is the only area officially where Jewish people can live permanently or temporarily. You're bogged down in documentation, and it's possible, but very difficult to leave. This is something that's put in place under Catherine the Great and, maintains for, about 200 or so years. Grossman's family, however, was fairly wealthy, so he was actually able to leave this. He does leave as a teenager when he's 14 to go to, I believe it's Switzerland, with his mother, who raises him. Most of his childhood is being raised by his mother before being brought back to Ukraine, living in Kiev, at which point, as a teenager, he lives through first the revolution that happens in 1917, and then the ensuing years of civil war. Through that, he eventually goes on to go to college, studies chemical engineering, comes back to Ukraine, works in factories doing chemical testing. Not super great for his health. His father, who left him as a child, but he still maintained a sort of relationship with, is able to get him out and is able to get him into a different environment. That's where he begins to publish some of the writing he's been working with so far, and he goes on to write some early novels. The first one is Gluckauf, which is talking about German miners. He goes on to write Stepanakul Trugan, and he's drawing a lot of influence from his time as a chemical engineer, which does become more interesting, especially as he goes to his later years and becomes a little bit less inhibited in some of the things that he saw during those years, including some effects of collectivization, which is known now as the Holodomor, the hunger which led to the deaths of some number of millions of people as a result of failure of collectivization policies. From there, he goes on to become a writer of some success, and then war breaks out, at which point he becomes a war writer, he becomes a journalist, and he goes to the front lines to report what he sees there. Now, that's going to fundamentally set up really what carries out the rest of his life in terms of his writing, for the most part. He writes 3 novels, ultimately, about the war. The first is The People Immortal, written mid-war. The second is Stalingrad, which is started during the war but finished after the war. And then finally, started after the war and finished way after, is Life and Fate. So Stalingrad is finished in the late 1940s, and getting it published is a challenge. So what happens is, in the 1950s, he's able to get it published in Installations in a magazine. Now, that is with some edits. His editors don't like some of the themes, don't like some of the things he's portrayed, and especially they don't like the obvious Jewishness of the novel, the Jewishness of some characters, rather. At this point in time, the official line of the USSR, which is going to become relevant in our discussion here, is the phrase, "Do not divide the dead." Basically, the idea is, in World War II, everyone suffered greatly, which is a true statement. However, that then becomes a cudgel against certain groups who may have suffered more. Obvious example, Soviet Jews, who Vasily Grossman was a part of a number of Jewish journalists who did a lot of work to document crimes against Soviet Jews. Vasily Grossman was greatly impacted by the war. His own mother was killed by the Nazis who still lived in Berdichev after being imprisoned in a ghetto, and also all the work he did on a book which would not be published in Russian in the USSR, would only be published outside much later, called The Black Book, which is a compilation of the work of Jewish journalists about Nazi crimes against Soviet Jews, was more or less not suppressed, but I mean, in a sense, it was never brought to the public's attention. This very personal connection he had to a very outsized suffering was not officially acknowledged by the Soviet state at the time. So that became a problem, but he fights through a lot of that and manages to publish Stalingrad in a modified form in that run in the 1950 to 1951. Now, when that finishes, initially it's received very well. He, during the war, is a well-loved writer. He's perhaps one of the most popular writers of the war, and it's received as such. However, it's not loved at the highest levels, and that leads to a period of denunciations from 1951 to from the end of the publication run until Stalin's death. But Grossman was then hounded by a wave of denunciations. The basic idea is that at some level towards the top, we can obviously not say exactly where this came from, but the idea is generally drawn towards, Stalin may have read this, may not have liked it, and then that filters down into, well, this is revisionism. How can this man say that he is representing what happened in Stalingrad? Who is he? Just a guy who was there writing about it when it was happening?
What, were you there experiencing it? Come on.
And that leads to a wave of people backing away. Many of his friends stop talking to him. His editors denounce his work. The publication company that puts it out wants their advance back. Things are not going great for Vasily Grossman. This is also during a time of rising anti-Semitism in the USSR, which is largely, but not solely, attributed to Stalin. We'll talk about this more in the episode, but this is the era of the so-called doctor's plot, in which it is alleged that a group of Jewish doctors have tried to kill Stalin. This is a really important thing for Grossman, who at one point is brought into a meeting under false pretenses and is then forced to sign a letter condemning these doctors. And he's also being noticed more and more. He's being more and more ostracized from public life at this point in time, which stops not all at once, but Stalin dies in early 1953. He dies in March of 1953, and in the months after, there are shifts at the highest level of the Soviet government, which then start to change things, right? A month after Stalin's death, the Kremlin publishes an article in one of the main state newspapers, Pravda, which basically says the doctor's plot was overblown. The evidence had for it was extracted using illegal methods, i.e. torture, and this was not something that was in effect something that is stood by now legally. At the same time that's happening, right, you've got the highest level of the Soviet Communist Party, who are now jostling for power. One of the most key figures of this is Lavrentiy Beria, who's the head of the secret police, who is at the head of the services at the organs which were producing the evidence for the doctor's plot for other major murders, assassinations of this time, who very quickly moves to change things. He issues a broad amnesty to about 1 million people in the Soviet Gulag system, not including political prisoners, notably. He ends forced labor in some cases in logging and industry and some other things by moving ministries around. And he also ends some massive forced labor projects that were going nowhere. Now, that wasn't done in the kindness of his heart. That was, as read by other members of Soviet leadership at this time, read as him positioning himself to be the successor. So, a figure that we've talked about quite a lot, Khrushchev and several of his allies ultimately have Beria arrested and later put him on trial, and he's executed through that. What this means for Grossman is not an immediate turnaround, but the pressures that people have been putting on him throughout this period, through 1951 through 1953, start to be alleviated. People who were previously denouncing him, even if they were his friends, although maybe not coming back to give him a call saying, hey, Grossman, well, I don't think they call him Grossman. They probably said, hey, Vasily, hey, Vasya, how are you doing? Now they're just ignoring him. And there are even a few who come crawling back. And in 1953, 1954, he actually even gets a version of Stalingrad published again, with even some parts of it restored that were not done in the original run. In this same time period, starting in 1952, that's when Grossman starts writing Life and Fate as a follow-up to Stalingrad. But throughout this period, he becomes less and less optimistic that it's going to be published, especially by the time he's in 1953, right? I mean, we use this phrase sometimes, writing for the drawer. And the thing is that Grossman was not optimistic about it being published, but Grossman was certainly not intending to write for the drawer. He was always intending to write for publication, as far as we can tell. Certainly, I'm sure there were moments of doubt, and I'm sure that there are sections and pages and maybe even chapters and whole parts of the book which may have been written with that doubt. But the evidence that we have, the documentary evidence that we have, is that he really wanted this book to come out. He's almost done writing Life and Fate by 1954, and it is a continuation of Stalingrad as we understand, but it is in a new context. So Stalingrad is being written in the context of his experiences in the war, but Life and Fate is being written in a slightly new context. After the war, Grossman moves into a writer's village outside of Moscow called Begovaya Village, and that's where a number of writers and composers are given apartments as sort of like this nice little space for creatives. A year after he moves there, 1947 is when he moves there, 1948 is when this happens, an interesting figure returns. Nikolai Zabolotsky is a very important poet for this time period, and he's returned in 1948, which is very unusual. He's not rehabilitated, not yet, but he is returned, and he's returned to Moscow, and he's given an apartment there, which is very unusual, and that just doesn't happen, really, especially not in this time period. Most returns, at least most returnees who come back to major cities, that happens in the 1950s, about 7 years later. But he moves into the same area that Grossman lives in, and because of the nature of him being a relatively influential poet or person, and Grossman and him strike up a friendship, and it is through him that he learns about much of the ins and outs of the Gulag. Of course, their conversations are not themselves written down, but we do have an idea of what Grossman learned because Zabolotsky would go on to publish a memoir of his of the events he went through, and based on a biography written by Zabolotsky's son, Nikita, who recollects Grossman's conversations with Zabolotsky. Grossman approached these conversations as a journalist. He was approaching it to get the full story from Zabolotsky's arrest in 1937 to his time in the so-called Big House in Leningrad, where he was interrogated by the KGB. Big House, which, by the way, is still there. I think Matt and I went by that when we were living in Petersburg.
Yeah, we didn't go in, but
we tried. But surprisingly, they aren't real big on tourists going in for some reason.
Yeah, I think you have to be invited in,
right?
So to speak.
So to speak. And so that begins to affect his work. And by the time he is in 1955, which like this work is going beyond the initial period it would have been planned to go on, or at least he thought it would go on. He writes a letter to a friend of his, Semyon Lipkin, and says his work is taking him in a new direction. In 1955 and 1966, this is a really interesting set of years for Grossman. Interesting in a number of senses. 1955 and 1966, this is now a couple years after Stalin's death, and more returnees are starting to come to Moscow, and they're trying to have their cases expunged. Even though they have been returned from the Gulag, they're still under that legal threat, still under that suspicion, and it is only by getting their case expunged that they can get a lot of bureaucracy to go their way, or at least to be less against them, as we will see in some of the things we will talk about today or have talked about in our other podcasts. And it is in that era that Grossman begins to meet more of these people and begins to interview a lot more of them. This is also a period of interesting personal struggles for Grossman. In 1956, he leaves his wife, Olga, of about 20 years, for Nikolai Zabolotsky's wife, Yekaterina Zabolotskaya, and they spend the next 2 years living together. By all accounts, this was a great period of great happiness for Grossman, who he had shared his life with Olga for over 20 years, and they had struggles. Grossman blamed Olga for the death of his mother. You'll see that reflected more or less exactly how, maybe those feelings exactly in Life and Fate itself, that same struggle. And this was a very happy period for the two of them, although quite guilty. And it's that guilt that would eventually drive them apart about 2 years later, when Zabolotsky, who is not doing great mentally at this point, is basically on the verge of death because of the alcoholism he's developed. And Zabolotskaya, Ekaterina, leaves Grossman to go back to him. And Grossman goes back to Olga, his wife, although she never forgives him for, up and leaving her after 20 years.
Hard to see why.
Yeah, right, for sure. He keeps, and he's also doing a number of other things in these years, but just to cut it short, because we're going on kind of long, and we will have many more episodes to talk about the particulars of this period. For another couple of years, with the ways he's rewriting it continues, his work on it continues until 1960, is when he has it typed up, it makes a few more revisions and decides, all right, I'm going to have this published. And this is against the advice of pretty much all of his friends. His friend Semyon Lipkin, who I mentioned, tells him, you do not have this published. This is not going to get published. I've gone through, here are all these things that could get you arrested even now, even today. And in one of these conversations, reportedly, he has an outburst at Lipkin, and he tells him, I'm not a coward like you. I will not be writing for my desk drawer. So going back to this idea of writing for the desk drawer, I'm sure there were moments of doubts, but ultimately it seems that Grossman really was a writer of his time, really was a writer of a system. And Matt has mentioned previously, he thinks it's wrong to categorize Grossman as a dissident writer. And I think in one way that you can see it here, in that he is writing not to say, I need my writing out in the world for the world to see what my state is like. He is writing for the Soviet Union itself. He doesn't try to smuggle his work outside, like Boris Pasternak, who, by the way, at the same time period, he does get his work smuggled. Dr. Zhivago smuggled that and published abroad. Obviously, that had repercussions for him, and that could very well have influenced that decision, but you could also read that as the audience Grossman is writing for. So,
yeah, he could have done it. It was hard to do, but it wasn't that hard.
For sure, yeah.
Like, people did it. If you were sort of connected enough, it was a possibility.
Yeah, and, going back to Pasternak, it had just happened, So he submits it, and it does not go well for him because they report it to the Central Committee, and the Central Committee says, you must denounce this, which they do. And then the KGB shows up at Grossman's door. They are there for an arrest, but they are not there to arrest Vasily Grossman. They are there to arrest his book. They walk in, they search his study, and then they take him, not to prison, but to other places in which he'd taken his novel, to the typist, to the print shop, whatever, and they confiscate all other materials related to it, and then they return Grossman to his home. The novel is arrested, but not destroyed. It's kept. All his notes are kept, and they'll be later released in, I think, the 1990s, maybe the early 90s, but his work is arrested. However, Grossman has considered that possibility and has given a copy of it to his friend, Semyon Lipkin, but he has also, unknown to Lipkin, given a second copy of it to a school friend of his who is completely unconnected to the writer scene otherwise. So there are two copies which will float out there, and eventually it's that latter copy which will be, after Grossman's death, brought out of the Soviet Union and published abroad. Grossman himself never really recovers from this. This happens in 1961, although he does have some other major things to talk about. Really, his health begins to fail quite rapidly, and within the next 3 years, by 1964, he's been diagnosed with cancer. And on the evening of September 14th, 1964, he passes away, not knowing the fate of his novel. And that's Grossman's story. In short, there's a lot more to talk about, but we're getting a little long in this overall. And that's how Life and Fate came to be eventually. It would be published abroad in the 1980s later, and it would be published in the USSR in 1988, although quite redacted. So this novel, I think we have to think of it slightly differently than other novels like, say, for example, Mikhail Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, which was clearly never going to be published, right? Even less so. I mean, Bulgakov was, as you've talked about previously, in a bit of a protected position in the Soviet Union, but even still, Grossman was throwing his novel at people to get them to publish it, Life and Fate, which, considering if you've read this far with us, you'll know why that's so wild.
Yes. Although it is wild, but I mean, I don't know. Kind of looking back at a lot of the things that he did publish that were really well received, maybe there could be a glimmer there.
For sure. And, well, yeah, there's also more politics talk about the publishing magazines at this time. Interestingly, he submits it to a conservative magazine under the... Well, partially because the liberal magazine, led by an editor Tvardovsky, who helped him publish Stalingrad, were like the first ones to denounce him, whereas the conservative magazines had on occasion published some more controversial short stories and even defended it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of politics on publishing and all of this. It's a lot more complex than just, government bad, government doesn't like, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of how we've been conditioned to think about the Soviet Union and the publishing process there, but it's still quite complex.
So normally we would go ahead and do an overview of what's happened in chapters 1 through 31. However, because we've been doing daily episodes on that, we think that's a bit redundant. So if you would like a chapter-by-chapter analysis of this work, go to our daily episodes, which if you're listening to this in real time, they'll still be in our main feed. And if you're listening to this in the future, go to the show notes and you'll find a link to the secondary feed. Well, those will all be archived in perpetuity. But today, what we're going to be doing instead is talking about a couple key strands that we're going to start to follow throughout this novel. And Matt, why don't I throw it over to you? I've been talking for long enough. What are some of the key threads we should start following?
Well, there are a lot of threads that we are sort of knitting together to build ourselves this Grossman quilt, if you will. And these are things that we have sort of talked about on the individual episodes, but I kind of wanted to reiterate some of them as we go through them and kind of tie them together in this sort of main narrative. And this first episode is hard because we are introduced to most of, if not all of the characters or the main characters that we're going to be touching upon. So we have, I don't know, 4 or 5 at least, sort of main storyline threads. We have camps, we have frontline, we have sort of the home front, and there's sort of some subdivision variation between all of those. I think I wanted to just first sort of mention, and if you'll indulge me, I think you will, because I think this is an area that you like.
Yes.
In the military history of it all, because I feel like in order to really understand the sort of stakes of it all, I really feel like it's important to reiterate just how close this was to all being over and going the other way. I was reading part of an article that sort of. I wouldn't refer you to the article for this particular information because it was sort of mentioned in passing, but as I was doing some research, came across this sort of description of how the city was sort of set up as the battle was going on, which was that more or less the Nazis had captured everything except for a few individual houses that were set up on key junctures. And the Soviets were essentially able to sort of funnel the Nazis into particular predictable streets and particular times and patterns, and they were able to hold down an entire city just by occupying 10% or less of the total area in the city. And ultimately this is spoiler alert on how it ends. It causes the Nazis to miscalculate and think that the forces there are are so great and vast that there possibly could never be any sort of counteroffensive, and this is a great sort of story of triumph in this case. And so Grossman has something that he publishes that is, like you mentioned, there's many things he's publishing at this time being on the front that people are really enamored about. I mean, I couldn't imagine having a journalist today that has the sort of literary finesse of Grossman. I mean, it would be phenomenal. They wouldn't have anything to write about, really, I guess. In the U.S., probably, like, I don't know. I feel like they'd be just more writing like clickbait articles, so it's kind of misses the point.
That the real tragedy of our own era is that our Grossman is working. I was gonna say working for BuzzFeed, but actually BuzzFeed had a pretty good news division when that existed. Is working for ClickPop or something.
No, our Grossman's probably, I don't know, he's paywall behind the Substack or something. No one's gonna ever read our Grossman.
Well, I'm reading our Grossman, but I'm in the small overlap of people who love literature and are obsessive about particular journalists.
Good. So there's this article that he writes in the line of the main drive, and a particular quote is engraved still over one of the kind of, over, what is this statue? I already forget the name in English.
Like the Motherland Calls?
Yeah, the Motherland Calls statue over where one of the major hills that was sort of fought over. There's a mausoleum and a memorial complex there. Then there's a line about, from this article, an iron wind lashed their faces, but still they marched forward. And once more a feeling of superstitious terror gripped their foe. They're attacking us again. Can they be mortal? And it's such a powerful line. But according to this article I was reading, the tour guides that are around this area say they don't know where the quote comes from, and this is because of how Grossman has sort of pushed out the things that sort of the state takes from him to memorialize the dead. This is now part of just the Soviet mythos. This doesn't belong to Grossman, and he's pushed out to the point that, again, he's literally not even attributed to having this quote on this mausoleum today, which is wild. And of course, the author makes the point that by and large, there were a lot of penal battalions that were fighting, and we sort of make it out to be that these were all, diehard communist, anti-fascists that were fighting, but there were a good portion of, penal battalions and other groups that weren't there necessarily 100% by choice, let's put it that way. And so this is an interesting point that it ties together a lot of this first part and a lot of like what we're going to come to read. I feel like this first episode needs a lot of exposition and a lot of setup to sort of get into the why this book and why Grossman is so impactful. And this is, of course, because of the fact that he reminds us how close really we were as humanity to losing this war. And then it continues to speak to us forward many, many years into the future about how it touches, on a lot of themes, but just kind of specifically on how ideology functions. And it does it in a really, really perceptive way that I think is not always shown in art, literature, media, whatever you want to call it. I think that Grossman has a fantastic sense for that. And so all the things that we talk about in Life and Fate are sort of linked to the larger question of ideology, which is a huge question in the 20th century when you're having these sort of large battles, not just physical, but also ideological. And so everything that we read and everything we talk about, our Grossman quilt that we knit, is going to be sort of tinged with that backdrop, if that makes sense. And I thought that this sort of writing out of Grossman from official history that continues to today was such a wonderfully ironic, not not wonderful for Grossman or for history, wonderful for the point that I'm making on the podcast. Ironic point that sort of foregrounds that issue.
Yeah. To take that right to today, I think that's a really important point in that when Grossman does, we've talked about this in our individual episodes, and we've had some podcast listeners point this out to us as well. Grossman, his project in Stalingrad is a project of memorialization. He's bringing to life many of the nameless dozens of people that he met during his time as a reporter on the front lines. Life and Fate is also that, but it is that on a greater level where he's examining all these things we're talking about, these larger issues, this place of the Soviet Union in history, the place of what is human in man, all these things. But he does that always by returning the human, what is man to man, what is human to humans in this story at the moment of death, at the time in their times in the camps, whatever it is. And that's not always a good thing. It's also sometimes a bad thing. Not every human being is a good person. And that reflects people under stressful situations will act and, return to their basest instincts, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And I think that's a really important point because looking back on this period, there's a tendency to make everything heroic, right? If you ever lived in Russia, you know that like Americans love World War II. It's like the last good war, right? every war since then, every conflict is complex, with the exception of like maybe Desert Storm. Well, let's not get into that. Let's not litigate that. But the cult of World War II in Russia, I would say, is even bigger because it's more present, right? To give you a sense of context, if you're not familiar, 4 out of every 5 Wehrmacht soldiers, 4 out of every 5 German soldiers who died during World War II died on the Eastern Front, died fighting, the Soviet army or Slavic partisans, right? It's not just the USSR that's fighting here. You also have partisans. You also have the partisans who will later become Yugoslavia. A lot of groups here. But the fighting on that front is incomprehensible almost to the Western Front. The fighting on the Western Front is pretty tough. But again, 4 out of 5. I like the rates, the camps even not even, 1 in 30 or something like that. That's not the exact number, but 1 in 30 maybe soldiers, POWs on the Western Front die in the camps. 1 in 4 on the Eastern Front die. The brutality, the level of death and destruction is immeasurable, right? 2 million people, over 2 million people die in the Battle of Stalingrad. You know how many people, Americans casualties overall? 420,000. That's dead and wounded. Most of those are wounded, not dead. So in one single battle, now granted this is both sides, but it doesn't include civilians, I don't believe that count, is losing 4 times in this one city alone. Like these are measurements that we can hardly imagine from this front. And because of that, the effect it's had, the number of people who died is much greater in the Slavic world. A whole generation really is lost. And so today, if you've engaged with the culture around it, it is one of her, I use the word hero worship a little ironically here because you'll still see, right, certain cities because of their contribution to the war are designated hero cities. So you'll see their sign, Geroi, Grad of, Petersburg, whatever, Yaroslavl, many other cities. And the movies and media, this is also true in other countries, but just speaking to it, gain this patriotic element, which is just overwhelmingly like, this is great. Like, these are the guys who are sacrificing everything for us. And Grossman looks at that, and because he's of that time period, he knows that not everyone was that enthusiastic. He knows not everyone was a good person, but they were all there. And he's memorializing them as they were, as an attempt to return to humanity and to reject this sort of ideological approach that just must make all human life one thing or another. And he kind of says, it's very complex, right? He writes about the camps in which, the Nazi ghettos, and he says, there are a lot of collaborators in the ghettos. That's an uncomfortable truth. And that's the kind of thing that Grossman wants to integrate into history, that in say, the Nazi ghettos in occupied regions, there were people who did their best for others, and there were people who worked with the Nazi party. There were those among the Jewish population who worked with the Nazis. There were those among the local Ukrainian, Belarusian populations who did that. Good and bad. At the same time, it's a complex story, and that's what Grossman's trying to tell us here. That's this project of memorialization, possibly, as you might read it, as a way to push back on that totalizing ideologicalization ideological approach to understanding even their own time, much less that time 30, 40, 50 years onward.
Yeah, I think the key point for him is that to memorialize something is not the same as to valorize it. And that's what we see more so today when you describe something like the cult of World War II in Russia. And that is what is dangerous to do. And he shows us why, because he shows us where that sort of behavior leads. It leads to what causes the thing that you are trying to memorialize. And so the right lessons have not clearly been taken from Life and Fate. Maybe everyone needs to read Life and Fate. Maybe that's the lesson.
That could be the lesson.
Maybe that's what needs to happen in totality. And everyone has to listen to our podcast. But if you've been really naughty, you have to listen to the daily ones.
Right. And it is still relevant. We can't say how true this is today, because this is a conversation we had with Robert Chandler. Robert Chandler was the translator of most of what you're reading of Grossman in English. Almost all of it. I can think of a few counterexamples, but very few. We spoke to Robert Chandler, 2 years back? A little under 2 years, maybe a year and a half.
Who knows?
Some time back. And Grossman, if he's to be believed, said the only thing he read during his time reporting during World War II was Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. And if you've been following on the dailies, you're probably sick of hearing about War and Peace. You might be saying, you already did 6 months on that book. Can we not get away? I'm sorry, you're in Russian literature territory. You cannot get away. Chandler told us that he knows correspondents working in Ukraine, or at least did at that time, who were also returning to Life and Fate to try to understand that as well. So these same themes, we see them to today, same ideas, still relevant enough for people to be trying to grapple with them in this very book.
So should we talk about the book more?
Right, so now that we're 40 minutes in, why don't we talk about Life and Fate?
Yeah, we could.
We
probably should.
We got a couple points here. Is there any of them in particular you'd like to start with?
Okay, I think this is a good time for a break. We'll be back in just a second. And we recorded this, I promise, in the middle. We didn't record this at the end and splice it in.
Oh, yeah, we certainly never do that, ever. Well, this episode is brought to you, our listeners. You can support independent podcasting by heading to our website, slaviclitpod.com. You'll get access to the notes we used to make this episode, including links to all the secondary sources mentioned. You can also check out our blog for all of our daily posts so far, and you can read those if you have not been going along with us so far. You can always catch up. Not too late.
If you want to support the show but don't want to spend any of your hard-earned doubloons, you can join our email list for free at slaviclitpod.com, or you can leave us a nice review wherever you get your podcasts.
Questions, comments, want to appear on our Office Hours podcasts? Drop us a line. You can reach our voicemail at 209-800-3944. Or you can also email us a voice recording or text question at slaviclitpod@gmail.com. We'll bring your question onto the podcast and do our best to address it.
All right, back to the Grosscast. I'm going to start in the order that I have mine listed, because that's easy for my lizard brain to follow. These aren't necessarily in order of importance, but more so the order they show up, I think, in the book that I have them noted, which may in some cases indicate the order of importance. And the first thread that I think is really important, and that I probably didn't admittedly not that I didn't pay attention to it, but I've noticed it more, I would say, on this read-through of Life and Fate, is, as we're calling, the emergence of Jewish identity. And what this means is sort of I don't know for sure that this is the case. I'm not going to say this is the case for everyone, but this is how Grossman is depicting it in the book. So, Jewish people in the Soviet Union who did not necessarily think of themselves as Jewish. This was not a part of their identity that was strongly formed. This is not something that they would, probably voluntarily or, in a reactive way think of themselves as being, until all of a sudden it becomes extremely, extremely important and extremely, extremely dangerous, really. And there are many characters who have this moment where they say something along the lines of, I didn't think of myself as Jewish until now. And it is something that comes up again and again and again in the book. And Grossman foregrounds this in chapter 3, when there are 3 characters that are captured by Germans on the outskirts of Stalingrad, and there is a Russian soldier, just a Russian woman and a Jewish woman. And the Russian soldier he's sent to the prisoner of war camp. The Russian woman, she's sent she's briefly interrogated, and then she's given like some bread and let go. And then the Jewish woman, they take, and we never see her again. And she, Sophie Levinson, she has a larger role, more fleshed out character in Stalingrad. So you know who she is more if you have read that. But I think that the fact that Grossman puts this in chapter 3 is really kind of controversial. This is clearly something that he's intending for you to pick up on early. And for you to know that this is something that it is important. It wasn't the sort of, he wasn't on the side of the don't divide the dead, because it just, quite frankly, wasn't true. And so, this is something that's important to him. And later we see the letter from his mother, which is a very haunting chapter. And then towards the end of the book, we have another instance that we'll talk to when we get there of, I won't go into it much now because we're not there yet, but an equally, if not the most haunting scene from the book. This is my first thing that I wanted to bring up. This is pretty specific contribution of life and fate, I would say. Some people said that they've noticed or have started to notice some similarities between Grossman and Hannah Arendt and the essay Eichmann in Jerusalem on the banality of evil, and we'll talk about that when we get there, because yes, if you've noticed it, very good. This is something that we are going to dissect more as we continue. It's really in dialogue with this essay. Whether
that's intentional or not, very well could be. I don't know if we've established that yet. Eichmann does appear in this book, and so that will be giving us some fertile ground to compare Arendt's portrayal of Eichmann.
I'm not sure if Grossman had read that. I'd have to.
We don't know.
I'm not sure if he had, but for what it's worth, that even if he hadn't read it, it doesn't matter, because it shows you that there are lots of really smart people all across the world at this time in this intellectual network that are thinking about the same questions to such a degree that it could have seemed like they were all reading each other's work, which is actually even more interesting than if they had been reading each other's work, I think. So on why Grossman continues to be read and important to read is that he's engaging with this sort of intellectual network of this time. And he's really kind of square in the middle of a lot of these debates, and he's still not really read as much, appreciated as much as I think that he should be.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in terms of World War II literature, you're not going to hear Grossman talked about in the same breath that you hear other novels, even from that same era. You're not going to hear it talked about in the same way you hear Catch-22 talked about, or other such novels. Mostly novels of that era not talked about. It's novels looking back on that era, but
every high schooler should have to read Life and Fate going into it. That would make them love literature.
Yeah, that would do a great job of that. So let's transition here, because I think you and I both made notes on basically a very similar point. You've titled it How Fascism Works. I've titled it Their Wolfish Era. Let's talk about ideology.
Yeah, I titled it How Fascism Works because I was running out of top line ideas for my quotes.
Fair. It's number 2 on the list. What do you mean running out of ideas?
Well, I did them in different orders.
Oh, okay, got it.
My notes are a disaster.
Right, that's fair.
The amount of margin notes I have from doing the daily stuff is insane.
All right, valid.
So it's not really a complex idea on how fascism works, but one of the things that Grossman is really able to dig into and excels at is showing why individuals do certain things. And we will compare this very soon to how the sort of socialist bureaucracy crushes people. But when we look at fascism, there are some perceptive examples that Grossman gives throughout the book. And there's this one quote that I love so much on page 23, where he says, "What Mostovskoy found most sinister of all was that National Socialism seemed so at home in the camp. Rather than peering haughtily at the common people through a monocle, it talked and joked in their own language. It was down to earth and plebeian, and it had an excellent knowledge of the mind, language, and soul of those it deprived of freedom." And that is just such a really haunting way to describe it, because I think that the reason that in the West we like World War II so much is because it's so easy to look back and say, okay, good and bad, and we don't really have to think about it that much. But I think Grossman is really warning us against looking at things in black and white, because yes, on one level, of course, it's really easy to look back and say, okay, good and bad. But like you said earlier, there is both good and bad then within, as you continue to dig down and within everything, it's more difficult than just good and bad. And when we think that the things that are bad, when we think they're going to look or sound a certain way, in a way that clearly would be perceived as bad, well, how in the world would that be so persuasive to people if it was immediately identifiable as being bad or evil or not good for us? No, the things that are sort of the most sinister are the ones that are able to seep in our own language, and the ones that are sort of able to co-opt our sort of feelings, and like he says, our souls. That's a really powerful way to say it. The things that sort of they joke with you, they don't tell you or demand from you. They're able to sort of kind of pick you up and I don't know, put you sort of find a place for you where it doesn't feel like you're doing something bad or something evil, because most people don't set out to generally, right, do something that's evil. That's not what most people wake up to in the morning, unless you are perhaps my dog, in which case, possible. You get what I'm saying, though?
Yeah.
And that's what I think he's pointing at with how fascism works. Hence the title.
Absolutely. And moving on from there, too, the ways in which it becomes a self-driving machine. He also thinks in that chapter, it seems almost as if the guards could disappear tomorrow, and yet all those who have taken up those positions in support of this machine would keep on doing their job. The Nazis could disappear tomorrow, and this camp wouldn't change that much, as as Mostovskoy believes to be the case. And I think that is getting at something else here, which is that we've talked about the fact that there is going to be more comparison between, the Nazi forces and the USSR. Now, historically in my life, I have resisted when people try to say, "Hey, aren't Nazi Germany just like the USSR?" Because I think the particulars of these two societies matters a lot. I think that they are very different and worth really examining in their own context, not just saying, "Hey, isn't it bad when you have?"
Yeah, I have to respectfully bow out of those conversations before I end up on a list.
Yeah, me too. Because it's all beyond anything else. Like, to what end do you make that point of like who gets on that list of like, why, okay, so greatest, you got the usual list of like, oh, here's the greatest guys, but like, why don't people who have inflicted, say, why is not King Leopold, who inflicted 8 to 10 million deaths on the Congolese people, why is he not in that conversation? Racism is the sort of example. But anyway, the reason why I've always rejected that is because to my mind, I mean, on one level, it's because it's always just being used to score political points in an argument, so it's useless anyway. But beyond that, the question is, to what end? What do comparing these two things and saying that they are the same, what higher understanding does that bring that to? And I think when Grossman is approaching this, I'm very interested in this, because Grossman is not approaching this as a way to swing and make a political point and say, haha, I got you there. Aren't these two bad things just the same? Grossman is looking at these two entities, and I think it's wrong to say that he equates them to each other. What he does instead is examine the similar ways in which their ideological powers impact the people who live on them, and often deleteriously. I think there is a meaningful way in which there is a meaningful difference in the ways that the Nazis' deleterious effects are portrayed on the people in the camps, and later on even on their own people, and the way in which the Soviet state is, right? I think those are two different things, and yet the way in which they force people, sometimes into being the worst version of themselves, the least human, the least kind, I think that's where he's starting to look and say, because he's not just saying, these two things bad. He's saying, looking around him, and he's saying, we live in a horrible era. We live in a horrible, wolfish time. How can we exist? How can we live? What is the point? There's a pretty haunting scene in chapter 30 or 29 where the character Lyudmila Shaposhnikova is going to find her son who's been wounded. And she's getting on a bus in the city of Saratova, and she sees a blind soldier, and he grabs a woman's arm and says, hey, could you please help me get on the bus? I can't see. And this woman turns around, curses at him for touching her, and pushes him to the ground. And no one there, who are all evacuees, who are all safe because of people like this soldier, none of them help him. And Lyudmila thinks, what could cause that cruelty? Could it have been the Civil War? Could it have been, and here's a reference to the Holodomor that you'll see throughout, could it have been that this woman simply had too much instead in her life? Notably, she doesn't stop to help either, but...
Yeah, I know. I love that part, though. That was so funny when, she's just sitting there reflecting about, the world is so cruel. Anyways, got a blast.
Right, but that's not just true there. There's another point. One of Lyudmila's youngest sister, Zhenya, is living in an apartment with an old governess who worked for the family. Now, this Jenny, this woman that she's living with in a communal apartment, is an old German woman. And because of her Germanness, she is then suspect by everyone else, all these other ethnic Russians in the apartment. And their suspicion eventually lead someone, it's unclear who, to report her. And Jenny is then arrested and sent off to certain death in the far north, simply by the nature of her Germanness. Too, here we have this fundamental meanness of this relatively harmless old woman. And not even there, one of the women in the apartment, accidentally or not, never made clear, then kills Jenny's cat by pouring boiling water on it. So you see this kind of fundamental spirit of meanness. And in other places, Grossman talks more about this wolfish era, and I think what we're trying to do is tear apart all this fundamental unkindness that he sees around him. There's a character, Ikonikov, who tells Mostovskoy in the camps that he doesn't believe in anything, any major political faction. What he believes is human kindness. And I'm not going to tell you that that's exactly what Grossman believed, but I think Grossman is trying to pull apart why do we see this fundamental lack of kindness now? What creates this? What are the powers? What are the systems? What make us act this way, even in the absence of the Soviet state, right? Because the Soviet state is not just this big, strange bureaucracy which is impenetrable. It's the people that make it up. It's people that make things. It's the people that make things or don't make things happen. We've got this great back-to-back series of chapters where we've got the party secretary of a region who everything happens for him simply by writing a letter because he is at the head of the leadership. Everyone knows him. Everyone knows they should follow his commands regardless of what the rules are. It happens. 2 chapters later, we have Zhenya just trying to get a residency permit. And she is just jumping through hoops. She can't apply for one until a request is submitted for one through her job, but her job can't submit a request for one until something else has to happen. And they eventually submit an emergency one. The people at the office accept it, and they say, well, you haven't given us proof of why you need this. The proof of why she needs this is because she works there and she has a job there, and they say, well, that's not enough. Eventually she's on the verge of just leaving until an older, more respected figure who is not helping her so far decides, well, let me help you out. And because of his word that she is able to stay there, who finally gets her pass, her relationship, because they know this person and they make the system work for them. And this guy is very clearly, well, not very clearly, he then, someone menacingly comes on to Zhenya, very clearly intending a sexual return for that favor. But the larger point here is the machinery is not just machinery. The machinery is the people who make it up. And Grossman does not let us forget that.
Yeah, I know that we see a lot of the different levels of the Soviet state, but perhaps the most cruelty, and it sounds maybe strange to say, but some of the cruelest moments that are depicted are on an interpersonal level. Really cutting someone down when they're already down. Cutting someone even further down when you have a chance to help them. In a society that's not supposed to be built like that. When Grossman shows the fascists being mean and evil, it is shocking because of the sort of depravity and the kind of scale, but you sort of expect it because these are the bad guys. These are the ones who are evil. You would think that there would be some sympathy shown, right, to his own country, or that he'd be more sympathetic to that, but absolutely not. He shows that there is just a sort of, you can have a similar level of depravity on this interpersonal level, which is also really harrowing to read.
Yeah, absolutely. And that even goes to the family level, who kind of the core family that this narrative runs through is the Shaposhnikov family and their, various in-laws and marriages and all that. And even to the lack of love in relationships, to Victor Shroom and his wife Ludmilla. We talked about Ludmilla. Their relationship is not going great. It's pretty heavily on the rocks. Victor Shroom, whose mother was killed by the Nazis, blames his wife Olga for... sorry, not Olga. That's Grossman's actual wife. Blames Ludmilla for not bringing his mother, to stay with them. Which, by the way, is pretty much 1-to-1 with Grossman's real life example. Like, that's why I mess those things up. A lot of what Victor Shroom does in this book is things that happened to Grossman, or Grossman very clearly thought or went through. Which is just wild to be writing this novel about, like, a character who's very clearly based on you and your wife on, like, very specific details, than to go and write and some of the things that will happen here. So, like, you shouldn't read Victor Shroom as necessarily 1-to-1. Like, don't read it and think this is Grossman's voice. But it can be difficult considering how much he's, like, how close his life is to Grossman's actual life.
Yeah, there's definitely some what feel like stand-in moments, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, I know we're getting a little long. That's all I had to want to talk about. Is there anything you want to say to maybe wrap it up?
No, just that I know this is a bit of an exposition episode, but really consider looking at some of the daily episodes, especially if maybe you don't want to do all of them, but if there are any particular chapters that you thought were really striking, we might have something more to give you in an individual episode.
Absolutely. Exposition heavy episode, but hey, we've released 23, 24 dailies at this point. I think we earned a little exposition at this point.
You're telling me.
Now that we're at this right. Now that we're at this point, Matt, I got to ask, what are we tackling next episode?
Next episode, we are letting you, should you choose, take advantage of our office hours. Be sure to come with all of your comments, questions, and concerns. You really don't want to mess up the midterm. It's going to be really difficult to pull your final grade back up. So
yeah, it is about 60% of your grade. So
yeah, and I'm really bad at responding to emails. So
yeah, after 6 p.m. it's no go. So
yeah,
tough.
Some of this is script, and some of this is reality.
Some of this is something Matt's going to clip and send directly to his students.
Yeah. Stop emailing me. Stop emailing me at 11 p.m. Anyways, if you want to read Life and Fate and you, for some reason, don't have a copy at the moment and you want to read from the same copy as us, be sure to pick up a copy through our affiliate links on our website. We are reading the Robert Chandler translation, which is the one that we wholeheartedly recommend.
And before we let you go, we wanted to extend a sincere thank you to all of our followers, current supporters, Erica, Michelle, Juliana, Diane, Oleg, John, Timex, Melissa, Baron, Aldo, Ben, Gabe, George, Claire, Amy, Allie, Soraya, Jackson, Molly, Emma, Mike, Marianne, Mickey, Eric, Mike, Peter, Claire, Ben, Jeff, Inez, Mai, Robert, Joseph, Daniel, Lou, Nina, Gary, Janice, Mary, Ann, Isaac, Emily, Amanda, Caitlin, Yitza, Idini, and Packrob. Wow, okay, all in one breath. Been training for that one. I also wanted to thank 2 sets of authors who have been hugely helpful for us in putting this series together, especially in doing the background reading. These are not the only 2 books we've been pulling from, but these are where we've been pulling quite a bit of information from. So first of all, I want to say, if you have the time, you should definitely read Alexandra Popoff's book, Vasily Grossman and the Soviet Century. That one is a great book. used it heavily for our Stalingrad series. We're also pulling heavily from it for this series. Also, The Life and Fate of Vasily Grossman by John and Carol Gerard. Also, an excellent read. Both definitely worthwhile pieces to get into, among other books about Grossman as well. The music used in this episode was Staraya Kino by Peremotka. You can find more of their stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify. The links and spelling are in the show notes.
You'll hear from us again soon.